So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the first Australians and pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. First of all, thank you all for coming. Today we have Dr. Akshaya Kamalnath presenting her paper. We'll follow the same format as normal. So Akshaya will be given her time to present for about 25-30 minutes or so. And then we're going to have a general discussion, open up for comments and questions. And I'll moderate the chat for you, Akshaya, just to see if anything comes in and draw your attention to that. As we're a relatively small group, I think everyone can just unmute if they have a particular question and fire away, I think. So without causing any more delay, I'll hand over to Akshaya, and I look forward to hearing what you're presenting.
Thanks, Damien. Thanks everyone for coming during this, what must be a tiring part of the semester. So this is a paper that was recently published, but I've been working on it from before the pandemic, and then I updated it during the pandemic. So it's a bit of a long work in progress. So I'm very excited to present the finished piece here to all of you. So that's the title of my project, the post-pandemic analysis of corporate social responsibility in India, and that's my name. So usually you'd start a presentation or a paper with discussing with a simple definition of what the topic is and move on. What happens with CSR is that everyone's talking about it, but it's not so easily definable. Sometimes I wonder if everyone's talking about the same thing because we all seem to mean different things about it. So I have picked, so there's a range of different definitions I could have picked, but I chose to start with a definition by Oliver de Schutter, not because his work in corporate law is something I follow a lot. I think he doesn't do so much in corporate law, but I think this is an interesting definition, so I picked this. The first part, he says it actually has three possible meanings. So the first possible meaning, I think, is what we all actually mean when we talk about CSR. So where he says corporations owe responsibilities to various stakeholders, including society in general. So this last bit may be a little open to interpretation. Some scholars would mean that corporations owe responsibilities to all its stakeholders, but probably not. More generally, some people in society that are totally disconnected from the corporation, but some would take a more expansive meaning. So this is the meaning that we would stick with. But the second and third meanings that he gives, I think, are quite interesting and actually speak more to regulatory approaches to CSR than what it is. So the second thing he says is CSR is an alternative or soft law mechanism to the default top-down mechanism of regulating corporations. So this is really talking about how you might have some regulation, but it doesn't really have enforcement, strict enforcement attached to it. And third, he talks about CSR, thinking of CSR as an alternative to the idea of regulation itself. And this really goes to the idea of how we think about CSR as being something voluntary. You can actually tell corporations to, yes, we say they owe responsibilities to various stakeholders, but ultimately it's for each corporation to voluntarily decide on how to discharge these responsibilities. So in India, we actually stuck with the second type of regulatory mechanism, it's being totally voluntary for a long time, until quite recently when the company's legislation was overhauled, and one of the across the world, they called it a milestone in CSR. So one of the key points in the new company's legislation in India was to actually give a definition to CSR. So, and to have some sort of enforcement mechanism attached to it. So we've kind of gone outside of this meaning of CSR that everyone seems to think of when we refer to the term. So before I get into more details of what India did with CSR, how we ended up giving such a undefinable term, a definition, and some way of measuring it, I'll very briefly get into theories of the corporation, mostly just to ask if there is really a place for CSR in corporate law theory. So all corporate law theories are trying to address one of two things. They're trying to ask what is the corporation itself, or they're trying to ask what is the purpose of the corporation. So I've just mixed all the theories are together here in these points. I haven't categorized them as what deals with what the corporation is, what deals with what is the purpose. But very quickly, the old and the traditional theory used to be concession theory, which basically thinks of the corporation as a concession of the state. The state has allowed us to incorporate, so we owe duties to the state and maybe even some sort of duties to the rest of society because we've been given the special privilege to start a corporation. So CSR probably has the most kind of justification under the concession theory. This has fallen out of use in recent times because you have incorporation has become so easy. You just can go online and incorporate, start a corporation because of general incorporation statutes. It's cheap, it's easy, it's quick. So we don't think so much about it being a special privilege of the state. Then we went on to more law and econ scholars started to call it as a nexus of contracts, where a corporation is just a bunch of contracts between all the people that got together to organize themselves into this firm. And then in terms of what is the purpose of the corporation, the next two theories, shareholder primacy and stakeholder model, kind of offer ideas that are counter to each other, but basically shareholder primacy says that you need to have, the purpose of the corporation is to maximize wealth for shareholders, and eventually that wealth translates into benefits for all stakeholders. Whereas the stakeholder model just talks about stakeholders, the corporation's purpose being to take care of not just shareholders but also stakeholders. So there's no real hierarchy in the stakeholder model, whereas the shareholder primacy model, as the name suggests, says that shareholders come first. You'll see I've highlighted the enlightened shareholder value idea because it's not really a theory. I stuck it in here because it's become popular from the UK legislation that worded it this way, basically to say that we think of all other stakeholders as well, but we're still primarily prioritizing shareholders still. So it's enlightened shareholder value because we're thinking of everyone else, and by maximizing shareholder value, we're still thinking of everyone else because everyone stands to benefit. It's from the UK, but actually even under general law, even when you don't have such wording in your statute, directors have the kind of discretion to actually take care of benefits of stakeholders. So probably there is that element of CSR not being prohibited already under general law. So this is all of the established theories. You'll see I've added one theory towards the end, collaboration theory, which was proposed by Eric Shafi more recently. And I've kind of used this theory a lot through the paper, so we'll come back to it towards the end as well. But very briefly, Professor Shafi talks about collaboration theory being, so he views, according to this theory, the corporation as a collaboration between individuals that came together to set up the corporation, those that work for the corporation, and the government. And because there's a collaboration between all these different entities, he says they have a kind of unspoken contract where they need to treat each other well. So there's a fiduciary duty that each has to the other collaborating partners. So to that extent, CSR, according to him, companies should consider stakeholder friendly or corporate social responsibility type activities whenever there is a happy meeting of shareholder interests and stakeholder interests. Second, when there aren't many costs, so there isn't a meeting of both interests, but serving stakeholders doesn't really cost shareholders anything. And third, when the costs of serving stakeholders isn't really very clear, and this happens a lot. You don't know what the costs are when you decide to take on an activity, and then also it's okay to go ahead and serve stakeholders according to this theory. So yeah, let's keep that aside. I'll come back and revisit this. So let's move to my one crowded slide about the CSR requirements in India. I actually have taken the wording of the legislation there because, like I said, we've done something that hasn't done before. We've tried and defined CSR. So let's see how we actually did that. The legislation basically says that every company of a certain size, so you'll see at the bottom, that's having a net worth of 80 million USD, or those that have an annual turnover of 800,000 US dollars. So every company of meeting this threshold should, in each financial year, first of all, should have a corporate social responsibility committee, which should have board members on it. And in each financial year, actually spend 2% of their profits coming out of the past 3 years on CSR activities. And what does the board have to do? There's a provision, section 135, that actually makes me think it is quasi-mandatory in nature, the obligation, although some call it a mandatory obligation. So basically, it says that the board of these companies that are eligible or that meet the threshold should consider what the CSR committee has recommended, then approve that policy, and then disclose the contents of the CSR policy in the annual report and company website. And finally, and the last part is really the key, ensure that activities mentioned in the policy are undertaken by the company. So there is a board obligation. And yet, I don't think it's really mandatory, because what happens if the board doesn't actually go ahead and do this? They just need to explain in their company annual report why they didn't do it. So you'll see in the box here that if a company fails to spend the required amount on CSR, its board should explain the reasons for non-compliance in the annual report. This is all there was to it, but more recently there's an amendment that says failure to disclose will attract monetary penalties. So it's not failure to actually comply with the CSR obligation, but failure to disclose. So it's still quasi-mandatory. And you may be wondering what these CSR activities are. There's no real room for innovation there. The legislation actually tells you what they are. So there's actually a long list. I've put them into smaller, broader categories. So it actually says healthcare, education, promoting gender equality, empowering women, ensuring environmental sustainability. And the last one is contribution to government funds. So we have things like the Prime Minister's Relief Fund, Prime Minister's Care Fund, and things like that that gets used in, so most recently in the pandemic, but when you have a big disaster like floods or something like that, you use that. So essentially the government through this last category is saying, give us money to do our job. But anyway, that's one category, but the rest of the categories seem to be general upliftment of society. And in the policy documents that went before the legislation itself, in explaining what the government plans to do with this, and that's in my box, it says that corporations, this is the justification according to the government, corporations owe it to people and the society to pay them back in terms of social services and by building social capital for common good. This cannot be the sole responsibility of governments. So they're really asking corporations to come help them do their job a little. And also there's language in other parts of the policy document saying corporations should be part of this nation building exercise, etc. So that's how they view CSR, and that's how it got into the law. So yes, there has been a stakeholder focus if you're saying that the board has an obligation to engage in CSR activities, boards of these companies. But unfortunately, the rest of the law didn't actually echo this stakeholder focus. So they also had to tweak the main section talking about duties of directors, which, like in the UK and in other countries, most countries, in India also just referred to directors acting in the best interests of the corporation, right? So that usually translates into shareholders taking primacy. Here, when they wanted to very explicitly show that no, there's a tilt, we are taking the stakeholder focus route, they try to echo the enlightened shareholder value in the UK, but we don't exactly do what the UK says. So this section 166 basically says that a director of a company shall act in good faith in order to promote the objects of the company, and the rest is the key, for the benefits of its members as a whole and in the best interest of the company, its employees, its shareholders, the community, and for the protection of the environment. So we have a list, we probably have an order, but it wasn't, there's no indication to tell us that this is the order in which to think of them. So you could say that you think of all stakeholders equally, or you could think of, because members come first, you put them ahead. So people have said there's different views on this. Some have said that because you have all this put in the section, it shows that the government has taken a more stakeholder focus. Others have said that when you have everything here, so you're telling directors to consider everything, it actually changes nothing because you're giving directors the discretion to ultimately just do what they think. And I would say, I didn't put this in the paper, but the enforcement of directors' duties is still in with shareholders. So directors are most incentivized to still further the interests of shareholders, even if you have this language. On the other hand, having this language in the section gives you some sort of expressive value, that you're saying this in the section, so we want there to be a change in behavior, a change in the norm. So there's probably some amount of that going on here alongside the CSR provision, and I'll accept there is some of that, and I'll come back to that, but I'll stop here on while talking about directors' duties, and get into the final part of my paper where I start to assess where do we stand? What did we achieve? Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing with the CSR provision? So first, let's talk about what we achieved. It was a milestone in some ways. We've defined something that seemed to be so nebulous and undefinable. We found a way to measure it. We're saying that you need to spend on 1, 2, 3, 4 type of activities, and we will measure that in your annual reports. To show you'll let us know how much you've spent, so you can actually see who's actually in compliance with it. To an extent, I think it's a regulatory leap because you found a way to say that you disclose in a very quantifiable manner, and there are even penalties attached to non-disclosure. And this sort of definability, measurability, etc., is missing in international commitments to stakeholder-centric corporate activity. Very famously, the US, Business Roundtable in the US, 2019 statement, which says that the purpose of the corporation is for the benefit of all stakeholders, and so they take a distinct stakeholder-friendly focus in that statement. But there's been research after that to suggest that the very people who signed on to that statement didn't really change their behavior in terms of the corporations that they were heading. So maybe there's a bit of things we've achieved here in India by this, but then probably there's some things that got lost because by actually achieving these things, we also baked in a lot of rigidity into the provision. So there's no ability to innovate. Corporations have come up in the past, and also especially during the pandemic, came up with very innovative responses. So there were charitable donations generally, but there were also other innovative measures in the peak of the COVID, both first and second wave. We had one high-end group of resorts. The chairman of Mahindra Group actually offered to convert those resorts to temporary care facilities because hospitals were full, and also they pledged to create a fund to help smaller companies. So, none of this comes in the categories I mentioned. So using your facilities for something, giving funds to smaller companies. Xiaomi India's top managing director announced that they would donate N95 masks and hazmat suits to a few government hospitals in India. So that's, again, not clearly under any of the heads. So companies started to send a lot of questions to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs saying, can we classify this as CSR in our annual report for this year? So the first clarification that came out from the Ministry of Corporate Affairs said, sure, direct responses to COVID-19, when you make contributions to government funds, when you make contributions to like the N95 masks, etc., you can quantify that. So sure, now we say that that also can come under CSR. The second clarification actually came out in the form of FAQs, because there were that many questions going in to the government. And I think a very interesting part of those FAQs, which have extracted here but will not read out, goes to show how the government actually views the CSR obligation. It views it more as a compliance issue and not as a moral obligation, because in the FAQ it says that paying employees and workers during the pandemic, because India didn't actually have these sort of job seeker payments that Australia had, so there were no wage subsidies for corporations to pay their employees. So the government said that corporations should do it anyway because it's their moral obligation, and this shouldn't actually form part of their CSR expenditure. So suddenly it seems that the government thinks there's a difference between moral obligations and CSR compliance, although generally we tend to think that CSR itself is a kind of moral responsibility of corporations. Also, the non-quantifiable activities like just opening up your facilities for COVID patients, like the Mahindra resorts, that didn't find a place in what could be defined as CSR. Also, very luckily, we averted more mistakes. The government they proposed criminal sanctions for directors and officers of companies that don't actually comply with the CSR measures. It also said that if you don't spend the CSR money that you should, then it'll be appropriated and put in the PM's relief fund. So there was a lot of backlash, so that was put on hold. And in terms of impact, there's studies to show that some companies actually reduced their spend from what they used to. Some were spending 10% of their profits. Now they reduced that to 2% as required by the government. So they started to treat it as a ceiling rather than a floor, as usually happens with mandatory requirements. Another study looked at disclosures and found that they're very boilerplate. There's no real detail there. And most interesting, the CSR money spend actually doesn't reach parts of India that need it the most, probably because corporations want to spend it in and around where they are based, so they can actually reap the benefits in terms of reputational value. The activities undertaken during the pandemic was mostly in and around the areas that the corporations were based. So it wasn't really as useful in nation building as the government seemed to hope. And so my argument and proposal, first of all, my argument is that sure, we have this provision. I'm not saying do away with it. It has expressive value, but there is So when I say there is expressive value, I'm referring to arguments and ideas that people like Cass Sunstein have used in terms of saying that when you say something in the law, it has some sort of authority that it changes behavior. But we need to think about whether there is actually norm internalization as expected. CSR, maybe the norm actually already had been internalized in large corporations in India, which were doing CSR activities even before it became mandatory. And some seem to have reduced it after the proposal came in, provision came in. So I'm not sure how much value that had. But then I'm not saying take away the provision altogether, maybe retain it, but you need some flexibility. So I propose that we should add a catch-all category that can include things that sometimes may not be quantifiable, but you can still put it in there to show that maybe we can't quantify and say that 2% of our profits have been spent on this, but we allocate or we think this amount, we have quantified it in a certain way, and you can disclose that in your annual report. And finally, to come back to what my theoretical basis for this proposal is, remember I spoke about Eric Shaffy's collaboration theory, and I think that's most relevant. I'm not saying that that's my favorite theory, but I'm just saying that that's most relevant in the Indian context, because the government has come in and told corporations what to do. So they want corporations to help in nation building, etc. So they're very much viewing corporations as partners. So collaboration theory seems to suggest that corporations itself are everyone that's in the corporation and working for the corporation and the government. It's a collaboration between all of them. But there is a duty to treat each other fairly and treat each other well. And I think with this kind of rigid CSR provision, the government hasn't been treating corporations too well. So adding this sort of catch-all provision might help. So that's really what my proposal is. And I'll stop here and very happy to discuss more.
Well, thanks very much, Akshaya. I think that was a really good presentation. So thanks very much. Does anyone have any particular question? Tony, I think I saw that you, oh no, he has a go, I think. He put it in his chat. Yeah. So does anyone have a question to kick us off, or will I? Okay, Stephen, go ahead, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Akshaya. That was really interesting. I had no idea about all those developments, so it's really interesting to hear about them, because so many questions they raise in my mind too. I've got two, I think they're not related questions, and you can choose whichever one you want to answer. I'll give you a choice. The first is, and this is of interest to me given the work that I've been doing more recently. It seems that the responsibility that the legislation imposes is directed squarely at the directors. It's their job to do the CSR heavy lifting. And as you say, that can give rise to all sorts of strategic ways of complying with that obligation. I'm wondering where the shareholders fit into this picture. I mean, are they simply the passive recipients of this information? What powers do they have to actually do anything? Indeed, are they doing anything about it? Or are they simply accepting the information that's being put? So that was one question. The other question was that statement that was in that little box, which began, corporations owe it to the people, and then went on. Is that actually in the statute? And if so, where did that come from? Anyway, pick whichever one of those you want to answer.
I'll just answer both. I liked the first question a lot, so I have to answer that. But the second one, no, it's not from the statute. It's from the policy documents before the statute. So it's called the Standing Commission report or something like that, where they discuss various parts of the various new provisions in the Act. So it comes from there. There's other parts in the Standing Commission report where they talk about nation building, etc. But I thought this was an interesting paragraph. So your first question, no, shareholders have not seemed to take any sort of action at all on this. So that's why the government has come back with amendments to say we want to find ways to enforce this, because even when the boilerplate disclosures, shareholders have done nothing. So then they've imposed penalties. So yeah, I don't know how much shareholders have appreciated this mandatory obligation at all. And communities, the big corporations were already doing a lot of CSR around for the communities in which they were based, like the Tatas were known for a lot of CSR. So yeah, shareholders have not been in the picture. And I'll also add one more thing. I should have actually started with this while answering you, Stephen, that while talking about the theories, or somewhere I've referred to one of your papers with a very interesting name about birds and bats.
Yeah, it's an old Aesop's fable. Yeah.
Will, I think you're next.
Thanks, Akshaya. That was such an interesting presentation, and congratulations on your marvelous publication. I was thinking about your slide tilt to shareholder focus, and that was a provision, I think, that was extracted on that slide. And it interested me because this conflict between market or commercial value and what economists would call externalities, but everybody else just calls sort of, bad things that corporations can do, or, bad social environmental impacts that capital market activity can lead to, is so pervasive across financial market regulation now. So, pensions and decarbonisation confronts all of these same problems. A pension fund owners and operators, or operators rather, have to pursue returns, but there's increasing questions about whether they can pursue returns at the cost of investing in destructive, carbon-intensive industry. Same in central banks. So of course there's this huge conflict in the EU at the moment between the primary and secondary mandates of the European Central Bank. Primary mandate, price stability with all the ideas about market neutrality. Secondary mandate is everything else: environmental sustainability, labour market equality, gender equality, all these other economic and social objectives of the European Union institutions. So it just seems to me that this is such a pervasive conflict, and it wasn't a pervasive conflict 20 years ago because it wasn't being written into laws, and there wasn't this enormous shareholder appetite and social appetite to force significant changes in the way that investing activities and commercial activities were undertaken. There's I suppose I've got two questions after all of that throat clearing. The first is, at a concrete level, what happens when shareholders sue for lost value as a result of socially responsible decision makings that lead to suboptimal returns for the corporation? And does that tilt to the shareholder focus have any immediate impact on those kinds of sort of bread and butter questions of corporate law? And secondly, at a higher, more conceptual and much more interesting level, at a level of regulatory design, how do you start to build sensible regulatory frameworks which accommodate this tension between market return and social impact? And I'm thinking there's a lot of literature in the international law space, particularly the relative normativity literature kicked off by Prosper Veal in the 1980s, because international law has been grappling with this for a long time, because treaties want states to do everything all at once. And there's this big question of, well, okay, if that's what you want, how do you actually achieve it in concrete regulatory frameworks? What are the design principles you bring to bear?
Yeah, on your first question, it's my view that shareholders can't actually make that. They're not going to be successful if they make that claim that by pursuing these sort of socially responsible activities, we've lost out on profits, simply because directors have always had discretion to choose what's good for the company. And they can always justify it saying that, look, this is good in the long-term interests of the company. So we're preventing a crisis, we're gaining reputational value, and that's bringing shareholder value eventually. On the second thing, I don't know all of that international literature you've been referring to. That sounds really interesting. But in terms of what framework we need to think about to balance everything, I think it's really tricky to actually give a very prescriptive framework for directors, because the more prescriptive you are, the less room there is to innovate. But I've also taken note of all that appetite, not just shareholders, but societal appetite for this sort of more environmentally friendly, socially responsible behavior on the part of corporations, which I think corporations do care about, because they may not be their shareholders, but they're their consumers. They're good for business. So throughout history, corporations have been getting behind movements. In the past, corporations got behind the gay rights movement. So whatever social movements that they thought the time has come, yes, we'll get behind this and we'll use it, right? So I think these incentives exist for corporations to act. We need to push in that direction, but we can't have a prescriptive framework, because the more prescriptive you make it, the less room there is to innovate. But yeah, I know not everyone agrees with that. I've been keeping track of all the central bank discussions in Europe that you've been mentioning, not in too much detail, but it's there on the periphery. And I think I've been yes, I'm not too sure how much they should have those mandates within the central bank. I would favor other legislation specifically on these issues than ask bodies that are not specialized in this area to start making decisions on social issues.
Thanks, Akshaya. The difficulty, and then I'll shut up. The difficulty is, of course, that you have, the Bank of the Netherlands pumping all of this public money, which is their unique statutory, raw input to the financial sector into purchasing things like, ConocoPhillips bonds and, eventually Saudi Aramco equity. And so, someone, and that's the thing with this climate stuff is so urgent. Someone needs to say, look, please stop doing that. please stop supporting all these industries. So it's the central bank stuff has this very public component as well as this private component. Thanks a lot.
Right. I hadn't thought, that's a good component, interesting component to banking, I guess. Thanks.
Yelena, I think you're next.
Hello, thank you, Akshaya, for that paper. I had sort of two questions. The first is basically sort of asking you to confirm that what your sort of comment is on the whole situation. As I understood it, you indicate that there might be grounds for saying that legislative intervention, regulation, trying to cajole businesses, companies, firms to do CSR might not have the intended effect, given that there's already a culture of doing that maybe in India or elsewhere, and we might see that in the evidence that you presented in terms of ceilings becoming floors and vice versa, and boilerplate disclosures changes and how that might occur specifically with this pandemic. So I wanted to ask you whether there is something to say for the fact that companies have already bought into this commodification of good deeds, that it is actually valuable in a commercial sense. We've heard a lot of criticism about that in the cultural sphere, but leaving that to one side, that, quite apart from legislative intervention and regulation, it seems to me, and I don't know whether you agree, that there's a culture in the commercial culture that is actually a good value to do CSR in whichever context. The other question that I wanted to ask, I don't know whether you looked into this at all, but I thought the more that firms are doing this, whether through some sort of cultural shift, or through regulation or legislative intervention, what's the impact on charities and the charitable sector? And has there been, for example, a freeing up of the definition of charitable purpose? I'm not sure what the law on charities is in India, but there was a couple of years ago a decision in New Zealand which significantly freed up liberalised the definition of charitable purpose to allow more charities to register as charitable trusts and receive all the benefits and operate in the market. I wonder whether that might be getting into the territory of charities and whether there might be an effect on that. I don't know whether you've observed anything like that.
Yeah, That's an interesting question, the second one. I have been aware of that New Zealand decision, and I know India doesn't go that far with the definition of charity. But actually, there is an impact. Not my paper, but I've seen research that came out after mine about, so when companies have to spend this amount on CSR, not every company has the resources. I don't mean in terms of money, but the ability to get into the charity space. So some big companies actually set up foundations and they put money into that foundation, whereas some not as big, or maybe they don't want to invest in their own foundation, they've actually been paying money to certain charities to put that as a put that down in their annual disclosure, annual report as, hey, we spent on a CSR activity by paying to a charity that deals with one of those designated items. So that has helped the charity sector in some ways. And the paper I saw was actually interviewing, they interviewed some people in the charity sector, but they weren't always positive about it. So they were saying that sometimes you get money from the corporation on a certain project, but the moment they reach their ceiling of 2%, they pull that's all. They won't give any more, when actually the charity might want more to kind of go through with the project. And I think that actually helps my argument, because I'm saying that if you give corporations the space to innovate and allow corporations to pick up things that they are interested in, even if it's stakeholder friendly, they will see it through. Whereas if they're just fulfilling some thing that they're asked to do, they'll just treat it like a tax. So I think that's your second question. I'm totally forgetting your first question.
I think you've answered. I think you've answered my first question. I think it was just sort of a
the cultural shift. I
comment
remember
on your thing, whether intervention actually might achieve the opposite purpose.
Yeah. I remember it. Yeah, I think intervention can be counterproductive sometimes. So yeah, there was. I'm not saying there was a culture every company would do it. No, the big companies, especially the family-owned companies, there was a culture of CSR there, but that may have died down a little. Not died down, but that's reduced because it's seen as something that you have to do rather than we're doing this for our reputational capital. So.
Viv, your question next.
Thanks, Akshaya. Really interesting paper. My question really, I suppose, leads on from what you've just been talking about, and that's, you will know that a lot of people in environmental movements think that corporate social or corporate activity around sustainability is often very superficial and is called greenwashing. So I'm wondering whether there's any evidence that that's happening out of this requirement that there be CSR. Yeah, you started talking about that in response to Jelena, but yeah.
Thanks, Viv. I think this actually gives is an invitation for companies to greenwash, actually, because we're saying spend money on XYZ activities, but we're not saying clean up your act. What Will was mentioning about externalities. So in the company's normal business, if there are negative externalities, we're not saying address them. We're saying that's okay. You continue doing your business as usual, but go ahead and spend 2% on this. And if you do that, then you're all good. So maybe that could amount to greenwashing, except since that's a regulatory requirement now, I'm not even sure that helps a company say we're so virtuous, we've been doing this because everyone's supposed to do it. So yeah, there is a bit of that.
So is there any investigation into the quality of what's done, or is it just a matter of we report very simply what you told us they had to report?
Yeah, you mean, is there investigation of the quality of their day-to-day activities, or you mean of
the CSR activities? Like, is it just tick a box?
Yeah, it's tick the box from the government's end, but there's been investigation from researchers. Right. So that's where I picked out one study which said that it's probably helped in some cases, but it hasn't reached the parts of India that probably really needed it.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Pauline, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. And thanks, Akshaya. It's really, really interesting. So I'm just picking up on the threads of what other people have been asking, really. So my question was whether you think voluntary CSR will, in fact, rise over time. Because it seems to be one effect or possible effect of regulating this minimum amount is that it sort of somehow changes the nature of that giving. So it doesn't have the same sort of bright, saintly type qualities of going above and beyond, and whether corporations might start to capitalise on, we go above and beyond and make that a selling point. So that's one question. There's something qualitatively different about mandated CSR and voluntary CSR. So maybe even one is no longer CSR in the same way. And the other question was just picking up on Yelena's point about charities and charitable purposes. I wonder whether it would have been more sensible to limit the purposes for which corporations, purposes for which corporations could give this 2% or whatever, to recognise charitable purposes. Because if you think about recognised charitable purposes representing what the state considers to be for the public benefit, then that, you're ensuring that in some way there's a clear link there. But also you've got potential then for a charities regulator to be overseeing operations. So if this scheme was operating in Australia, for example, then you've got the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits regulator who can then look at and scrutinise how the funds are actually being used and ensuring that, there's no bad faith or money's not being used for the purposes to which they've been given. Yeah, so those were my two questions.
Thanks, Pauline. I've just made a note to myself to check on India's charity regulator. I'm not sure what they do, because sometimes you see headlines, news headlines about something bad happening with what we considered as a charity. So I'm not sure there's very good regulation there, but I need to investigate that. That's a good point to look at, I guess. But I'll get to both your questions. The first question, I'm trying to recall. Yeah, I remembered. Increasing, whether there's a slow increase, right? And this is something that I actually support and I think should be the case. And I hadn't seen that when I started writing the paper, but I saw that during the pandemic, because it wasn't actually falling in the necessary CSR categories, but they went above and beyond because the situation demanded it. That's in India. Outside India, where we don't have this sort of stipulated CSR regulation, we're already seeing, because of the societal push, people getting into more stakeholder-friendly activity just to get that reputational capital. So maybe in India, that's what it will be going forward, that we not only have to comply with the CSR provision, but try and go above that in order to get some reputational capital. There's some empirical study that showed some companies diverting some of their money earmarked for advertising expenses to CSR activities. So that's such a clear link, right? So yeah, I think that's a good point. The second one on charities, yeah, right now the government's list of what constitutes CSR activity is so rigid and limited that adding another point on charitable things that are considered charitable purposes may be good. I've just made that much broader in my proposal and said have a more catch-all category, because I want more space for corporations to have innovative measures. Like recently, Lego said they're trying to use recyclable plastic. So that doesn't fall under India's definition, but it's such a good innovative measure. So I want those sort of things to count.
Interesting. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I suppose if I had to question myself, I mean, I'm also kind of interested in your points around like the potential contracting of CSR expenditure by certain companies. Yeah, so they're not spending as much now that they have like a particular percentage that they have to give. And maybe this is just more of a question about like whether there's research mapping that a little bit, because like it'd be kind of interesting just from an impact assessment perspective from this act, like what the trajectory of it is going to be. Like, is there a review process planned within this piece of legislation so that they're going to assess the impact of it in terms of the positive impacts it has in society as a result? Or are there particular researchers who are looking at this? Because I'm kind of wondering, will it be a net positive result essentially? Yeah, because I mean that's the ultimate aim. And if it has a net negative result in certain corporations because they essentially comply down instead of going up. I mean, maybe it kind of stems a little bit from Pauline's question as to whether this should be CSR at all, or whether there's, it'll expand out into something else then as well. Yeah, so there'll be extra obligations on top or whatever. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of a collection of thoughts, but it's more, what is there impact mapping happening in this, I suppose, is the more broad question. Yeah, either I suppose within the piece of legislation itself. So, or are there researchers are actually mapping it?
That's a good point. That I have what I mentioned about the spend decreasing over time. That's from empirical research by two researchers, one based in the US, one based in India, but private, not associated with the government. There is no impact mapping planned by the government. I think that would be great if they do it, rather than trying to propose criminal sanctions and things like that. They should be mapping impact, I guess. Yeah, so I don't know if they're going to do a second study, the researchers I mentioned, whether they'll do a second study to see how it happens over time. That'll be interesting, but I think maybe the pandemic has been a special kind of, it screws things up for a bit. So maybe they should restart their study in a few years.
Yeah, okay. Are there any other questions? We're getting relatively close to the hour.
Just quickly, Akshaya, who is this is going to be very sort of research, public sector research jargon heavy, so I apologize at the beginning of this question. Who are the end users of this research? Other academics, or are you designing this to feed into public policy processes or sort of private sector sort of processes? Who's digesting this other than people like us who are fascinated in your ideas?
Great. That's a good question. When I wrote this paper, I was writing it for the government. So that's why my proposal is tailored like that. Ideally, if I was writing it just for academics, I would have been like, I don't really agree with this. But since I'm writing it for the government, I'm like, okay, this is what you have done so far. Maybe there's some good in it. So I say there is some expressive value. But I know that asking them to remove the CSR provision altogether, that ship has sailed, I can't do that. So maybe instead have a catch-all provision. So I'm trying to make it work. So I'm hoping there is policy change based on that. That's how I wrote it.
Cool. And do you have, that's awesome. I mean, that's fantastic. Do you have, this is just, again, annoying public sector research, jargon heavy, usual caveat. The hardest thing for these kinds of positive policy projects is making sure that you have a link between your great research and any eventual changes to the regulatory framework which eventuates. So academics have this history of doing all this incredible research and sending it to regulators and legislators, and they go, oh, thanks, and they just write stuff and they never reference the academic. And when we're thinking about how we basically celebrate the work like this, which is really orientated towards positive, constructive policy change, it's always helpful to think about ways that you can evidence the role that you've had in any eventual policy changes. And that sounds really weird, but if you just keep things like emails to and from contacts in the government, or if you can email your work to people in the government. That's a really positive way to make sure that you get recognised for doing work like this, and it's not just, and the impact of it is recognised and attributed to you. Just a thought from the ADR portfolio.
Wow, thanks. That's 2 steps ahead of what I'm thinking, right? I'm thinking that I'm not even sure the government will go in this direction. Yeah, maybe I should be thinking of sending it to people. I also felt like corporations in India would want to consume and highlight this research because they have had a lot of trouble with it. So maybe I should proactively send it out to people as you suggest.
Well, we can also use intermediaries. So I have a really good relationship with a place called the VD Centre for Public Policy in India, which is like a legal/regulatory think tank, independent think tank set up by ultra high net worth individuals that have direct lines into Indian or Indian national, like the Attorney General's Department, et cetera, et cetera. And so we can also try and connect you to those people who can try and pass your research forward into the policy-making process.
Okay, I know people at Vidhi and they tend to be more, they tend not to take this view, but...
They don't agree with you, or they on this particular issue about CSR?
Yeah, I think so. The reason they have such a good channel to government is because most times they're not opposing the government so much. But yeah, we could try, I guess.
Well, I mean, look, it's your backyard, and it's more just if they're just people I know that are directly involved in and have direct pipelines into the policy making process, and so. But you might have better connections there, so
not
go
really.
for it.
I've engaged with the people that work on insolvency stuff in Vidhi, but not so much CSR. So maybe I should see whom you know and discuss that with you.
Yeah, I've got a connection to Orgia. I think who runs it, who's the founder, ex-Oxford guy.
Orgo, yeah.
Orgo,
okay.
yeah. Okay, cool. Well, that's just we might be able to boost your research a little bit into the policy making space that way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but only if you want to.
Yeah, I do actually. I hadn't thought that much into this. So now that you made me think, yeah, maybe I should get into that.
Yeah, we can go bilateral on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I just say thanks to everyone? This has been great, all the conversations with everyone.
Thank you, Akshaya.
Yeah, thanks, Akshaya. That was really good.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Akshaya.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.